The hospital smelled of carbolic acid and desperation. Sister Margarethe Hoffman pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the corridor, her starched white uniform stiff against her trembling frame, listening to the approaching footsteps of the Americans. Through the shattered windows, she could see the ruins of what had once been Heidelberg's most prestigious medical facility, now a makeshift field hospital in the spring of 1945, caught between two armies and belonging to neither. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The other nurses huddled near her, their faces pale in the dim light filtering through smoke-stained glass. They had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. The Americans were brutal, they said. They would shoot the wounded in their beds. They would drag the doctors into the streets. They would burn the medical supplies and leave everyone to die in agony. "They're coming up the stairs," whispered Anna, the youngest nurse, barely 19, her voice cracking. She clutched a rolled bandage like a talisman. Margarethe had been a nurse for 12 years, had survived the bombing of Berlin, had held dying soldiers from both sides in her arms, had learned to recognize the particular rattle of a punctured lung and the sweet, sickening smell of gangrene. But nothing had prepared her for this moment, the moment when everything she had been told about the enemy would be tested against reality. The footsteps grew louder, heavy boots on marble floors that had once been polished to a mirror shine, now cracked and dusty with plaster from the ceiling. Margarethe could hear voices speaking in English, sharp and authoritative. Her English was passable. She had studied it before the war, when the world had seemed full of possibility instead of ash. The door at the end of the corridor burst open. 3 American soldiers entered first, rifles raised, their eyes scanning for threats. Behind them came a man in uniform, but different. His jacket bore the caduceus, the medical insignia. He was tall, perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair touched with premature gray at the temples and eyes that moved across the scene with rapid assessment. "Captain James Morrison, United States Army Medical Corps," he said in English, then repeated it in careful, accented German. His voice was firm but not harsh. "We're here to establish medical operations. I need to know the status of your wounded and your supplies." None of the German nurses moved. Margarethe felt Anna's hand grip her arm with desperate strength. Captain Morrison took a step forward, and Margarethe saw something unexpected in his face. Not anger or cruelty, but exhaustion. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and his eyes held shadows that spoke of things seen and not forgotten. He looked, she realized with a shock, like every surgeon she had ever worked with who had spent too many hours trying to hold back death with nothing but skill and stubborn hope. "I know you're frightened," he said in German, his accent making the words awkward but understandable. "I know what you've been told about us. But I'm a doctor. Those men behind me are medics. We have wounded downstairs, American, British, German. Some of them will die in the next hour if we don't operate. I need your help." The silence stretched taut as wire. Margarethe could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Anna's rapid breathing beside her. In the wards beyond, she could hear the moans of the wounded, the delirious cries of men caught in fever dreams. "How many wounded?" Margarethe heard herself ask, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The other nurses turned to stare at her as if she had gone mad. Captain Morrison's eyes met hers, and she saw a flicker of relief cross his face. 37 in the courtyard. More coming. We have 3 surgeons, 6 medics. But we don't know this facility, don't know what supplies you have, don't know which wards are structurally sound. He paused. "I need someone who knows this place. I need someone who can help me save lives." Margarethe took a breath that seemed to fill her entire body. She had joined nursing because her mother had been a midwife, because she had been present at her younger brother's birth and had marveled at the mystery of it. Life coming into the world despite all odds. She had stayed in nursing because even in the darkest days of the war, even when the propaganda had grown shrill and the news from the fronts had turned grim, she had believed in one simple truth. A patient was a patient. Pain was pain. Death was death. And a nurse's duty was to stand between the suffering and the darkness, no matter who they were. "Downstairs," she said in English, pleased when the words came out clear. The main surgical theater still has power separate generator. Sterilization equipment intact. But supplies very low. No morphine for 3 weeks. Little ether. No penicillin since January. Something changed in Captain Morrison's face. A softening, a recognition. You speak English. I studied, Margarethe said simply. Before, Morrison echoed, and in that single word was an acknowledgement of everything that had been lost. All the bridges burned. All the ordinary futures that had vanished into smoke and ruin. He turned to the soldiers behind him. Sergeant, get the wounded inside. Priority to those who can be stabilized. Set up triage in the main hall. Then back to Margarethe. What's your name? Sister Margarethe Hoffman. Sister Hoffman, I need you to show me your surgical facilities. And I need you to ask your colleagues if they're willing to help. I can't order them, they're not my nurses. But I can promise them this. We will treat everyone who needs treatment. German, American, I don't care. A wounded man is a wounded man. Margarethe turned to the other nurses. In rapid German, she explained what the American captain had said. She saw doubt in their faces, saw fear, saw the weight of years of propaganda and horror stories. But she also saw something else, the same thing that had brought each of them into nursing in the first place. The desire to heal, the inability to turn away from suffering. Anna spoke first, her voice small but determined. I'll help. One by one, the others nodded. Some reluctantly, some with relief, as if they had been waiting for permission to be what they had always been, healers, not soldiers. Morrison's shoulders dropped a fraction. Releasing tension Margarethe hadn't realized he was carrying. Thank you, he said quietly. Then louder. All right, let's move. We don't have much time. The surgical theater had survived the bombing better than most of the hospital, protected by its location in the building's interior. As Margarethe led Captain Morrison and his team down the stairs, she found herself explaining the layout, where the supply closets were, which wards had roof damage, where the water lines were still intact. Other American medical personnel were arriving, 2 more surgeons, more medics, men carrying stretchers and medical kits. They moved with efficient urgency, and Margarethe noticed something that surprised her. They treated the German nurses with businesslike courtesy, asking questions about where to set up, where to find things, listening to the answers. In the main hall, the wounded were being brought in. Margarethe saw American soldiers, some barely conscious, blood soaking through hastily applied field dressings. But she also saw German soldiers, Wehrmacht troops in their gray-green uniforms, their faces tight with pain and something else, fear. Fear of what the Americans would do to them. One of the American medics, a young man with red hair and freckles, was working on a German soldier with a massive wound in his abdomen. He worked quickly, efficiently, pressing gauze against the bleeding, checking vitals, marking a tag. When he finished, he moved to the next patient, an American with a shattered leg. No difference in treatment. No hesitation. Margarethe felt something shift inside her, some wall beginning to crack. Sister Hoffman. Morrison's voice pulled her attention. He was standing by the surgical theater entrance, already scrubbing his hands in a basin of precious clean water. I need you in here. I need someone who can anticipate what I need, who knows where things are. Can you do that? Margarethe had assisted in hundreds of surgeries. Before the war, she had worked with some of the finest surgeons in Germany. But this felt different, crossing some invisible line, working alongside the enemy. Except he wasn't treating anyone as the enemy. He was treating them as patients. She moved to the scrub station and began washing her hands with the same methodical care she had been taught years ago. The ritual was calming. Soap, water, fingernails, between the fingers, up the wrists. The familiar routine in the midst of chaos. The first patient was an American, a young corporal with shrapnel in his chest. Morrison worked with focused intensity, his hands steady, his instructions clear. Margarethe found herself falling into the rhythm of it. Instruments passing from her hands to his, anticipating his needs, watching the miracle and horror of surgery as Morrison's skilled hands worked to repair what metal and fire had torn apart. Suction, Morrison said quietly. and Margarethe was already there with the tube. Good. That's good. 2 hours passed in concentrated effort. The corporal survived, was moved to recovery. Then came a German private, barely 18, with a bullet wound in his shoulder. Morrison examined him with the same careful attention he had given the American. "This one's lucky," Morrison murmured in English, then repeated it in German for the patient's benefit. "Missed the artery. We'll get the bullet out, clean it up. You'll live, son." The German boy's eyes filled with tears. "Danke," he whispered. "Danke." Margarethe watched Morrison's face as he worked on the German soldier. There was no difference in his expression, no change in the care he took. The same skilled hands, the same focused attention. She thought of all the propaganda she had heard, all the stories of American brutality, and wondered how many other lies she had been told. Between surgeries, during a brief moment when they were both checking supplies, Morrison spoke quietly. "I trained at Johns Hopkins," he said, as if answering a question she hadn't asked. "Best surgical program in the country. My mentor, Dr. Richardson, he used to say that a surgeon's job was to fight death, not other surgeons. Said that death was enemy enough for any lifetime." Margarethe found herself responding. "I trained in Berlin. Before all this, we had a professor who said something similar. That disease and injury were democratic. They didn't care about nationality or politics. Only we cared about those things." Morrison's eyes met hers over his surgical mask. "Sounds like a wise man." "He died in the bombing of Dresden." The words came out before she could stop them, carrying a weight of grief she hadn't fully acknowledged. "I'm sorry," Morrison said, and she could hear that he meant it. Not a political sorry, not a diplomatic sorry, but the genuine sorrow of one healer recognizing another's loss. The next patient was brought in, a German officer, Wehrmacht, with severe burns on his arms and face. Margarethe saw Morrison's jaw tighten slightly, saw something flicker in his eyes. This man might have given orders that killed Americans, might have killed Morrison's friends, his colleagues. But Morrison's hands remained steady as he examined the burns. 3rd degree on the right arm, 2nd degree on the face. "We'll need to debride the dead tissue. Get him on fluids. If we had penicillin." He broke off, frustrated. "We have some sulfa powder," Margarethe offered. "Not much. We've been saving it." "Get it," Morrison said. "Burns like this, infection is the real killer." As Margarethe retrieved the precious sulfa powder from the locked medicine cabinet, she realized what she was witnessing. Morrison wasn't making grand gestures or political statements. He was simply doing his job, doing what he had been trained to do, what he believed in doing. The Hippocratic Oath in action. First, do no harm. The German officer regained consciousness during the treatment, his eyes widening as he realized who was treating him. "Amerikaner," he gasped. "Ja," Morrison replied in his careful German. "American doctor. Lie still. I'm treating your burns." "Why?" The question came out harsh with pain and confusion. "Why help me?" Morrison didn't pause in his work, carefully applying the sulfa powder to the cleaned wounds. "Because you're injured. Because I'm a doctor. Because that's what doctors do." He glanced up briefly. "The war will end someday. But if I let you die when I could save you, if I become the kind of man who can turn away from suffering because of a uniform, the war wins. Even after it's over, the war wins." The officer said nothing more, but Margarethe saw tears tracking through the soot on his face. The surgeries continued through the night. American, German, American, German. A British soldier with a collapsed lung. A German nurse from another facility who had been caught in crossfire. A French forced laborer with a crushed hand. Morrison treated them all with the same focused care, the same determination. Around midnight, during a brief break, Margarethe found Morrison sitting on the floor outside the surgical theater, his head tilted back against the wall, his eyes closed. She approached with 2 cups of ersatz coffee, not real coffee, but at least it was hot and wet. "Captain Morrison," she said softly. He opened his eyes, accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. "James," he said. "When we're not in surgery, call me James." "James," she repeated. testing the name. I am Margarethe. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping the bitter brew. Around them, the hospital had settled into the strange quiet of a medical facility at night. Groans of pain, whispered conversations, the soft footsteps of nurses checking on patients. How many surgeries? Margarethe asked. 14, James said. 15 if you count the quick extraction I did on that kid with the shrapnel in his leg. Lost 2. His voice caught slightly on the last word. German corporal with the abdominal wound, too much damage. American sergeant, pneumothorax. Couldn't stabilize him in time. You tried, Margarethe said quietly. I watched you. You tried everything. Trying isn't enough sometimes. James took another sip of coffee, made a face at the taste. God, what is this made of? Acorns, mostly. A little barley. We haven't had real coffee in 2 years. James let out a short, humorless laugh. 2 years. Christ. He was quiet for a moment, then spoke again. Can I ask you something? Personal question. Yes. Why are you helping us? After everything, the bombing, the invasion, everything Germany's been through because of us. Why trust me? Margarethe considered the question carefully. I don't trust you because you are American, she said finally. I trust you because you are a doctor. Because I watched you cry when that German corporal died. Because you treat wounds, not flags. She paused. And because I am tired, James. So tired of death. So tired of choosing sides. Pain is pain. That is all. James nodded slowly. That's all, he echoed. That should have been all from the beginning. Before Margarethe could respond, one of the American medics appeared in the doorway. Captain, we've got a problem. James was on his feet immediately. What kind of problem? 3 German soldiers just came in. One of them shot Lieutenant Parker yesterday. Parker recognized him. He's well, sir. Parker's pretty upset. Says he won't lie in the same ward as the man who shot him. Margarethe felt her stomach tighten. This was the moment, she thought. This was where the veneer of medical neutrality would crack, where revenge would assert itself. James set down his coffee cup. Where's Parker now? Ward C, where we're keeping the American wounded. And the German soldier? In the hall. We haven't moved him yet. Bullet wound in the thigh, lost a lot of blood. James nodded. Get the German stabilized and into Ward D. I'll talk to Parker. Margarethe found herself following James to Ward C, uncertain why but feeling that this moment was important, that something crucial was about to be decided. Lieutenant Parker was sitting up in his bed, his shoulder heavily bandaged. He was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of clean-cut American face that might have looked boyish in other circumstances. Now it was twisted with anger and pain. Captain, Parker said as James approached. They told you? They told me, James replied calmly. How are you feeling? How am I? Parker broke off, incredulous. Sir, that German bastard shot me yesterday, put a bullet through my shoulder, nearly killed me, and now you're going to treat him? Put him in a bed? Give him medical care? Yes, James said simply. That's exactly what I'm going to do. That's not right, sir. That's not justice. James pulled up a chair and sat down beside Parker's bed. Margarethe stood nearby, watching, listening. The other wounded men in the ward had gone quiet, all attention on this confrontation. You're right, James said, his voice level. It's not justice. Justice would be a trial, a court-martial if he committed war crimes, prison if he's convicted. But that's not my job, Lieutenant. My job is to keep people from dying. That's all. I don't get to decide who deserves to live based on what they did yesterday or last week or last year. He shot me, Parker repeated, his voice rising. He tried to kill me. And yesterday you were trying to kill him, James replied quietly. That's what soldiers do. That's war. But this, he gestured around the ward. This isn't war anymore. This is triage. This is medicine. And in medicine, the only question that matters is, can I save this person? What if you can't save everyone? Parker demanded. What if you have to choose? Will you choose him over one of your own men? James's face grew tight. If I have to choose, I choose based on medical need. Whoever's most critical, whoever I can most likely save. That's the only ethical way to practice medicine. That's easy to say when it's not your friend dying. I've lost friends, James said, and his voice went cold. I've lost good men. Men I trained with, men I served with. I lost my best friend at Normandy. We went through medical school together, took our boards together. He died on the beach with a piece of shrapnel through his throat. And I couldn't save him because I was too busy trying to save 3 German prisoners who'd been wounded in the fighting. He paused, and Margarethe saw the raw pain in his eyes. You think I wanted to do that? You think I didn't want to let those Germans die so I could work on Tom? But I didn't, because Tom was already gone, and those Germans could still be saved. And because Tom would have hated me for letting them die out of spite. The ward was silent. Parker stared at James, his anger warring with something else. Understanding, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. I'm not asking you to forgive him, James continued, his voice gentler now. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm just asking you to understand that my oath doesn't have exceptions. I took an oath to preserve life. Not American life. Not Allied life. Life. And if I start making exceptions, if I start deciding that some lives matter less than others based on what uniform they wear, then I'm not a doctor anymore. I'm just another soldier with a gun, and we've got plenty of those already. Parker looked down at his bandaged shoulder, then back at James. I don't have to like it. No, James agreed. You don't. But I do have to ask you to accept it. After a long moment, Parker nodded slowly. Yes, sir. James stood, put a hand briefly on Parker's good shoulder. Get some rest. I'll check on you in the morning. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Lieutenant, I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad I could save you. And I'd do it again over any enemy soldier, if it meant keeping you alive. But not because you're American. Because you're my patient, and you were here first. As they left the ward, Margarethe felt something settle in her chest. Some knot of tension releasing. She had seen James's humanity in the surgical theater, had seen his skill and compassion. But this was something else. This was principle in action, the kind of moral courage that required not just skill but strength. That was difficult, she said quietly as they walked back toward the surgical theater. It was necessary, James replied. He looked tired, more tired than he had looked even after 14 surgeries. He's not wrong to be angry, but anger can't be what guides medical decisions. The moment we start treating some patients as less worthy than others, we've lost something essential. In Germany, Margarethe said carefully, we were taught to make such choices. We were told that some lives were more valuable than others, that German lives mattered more. That, she broke off, uncertain how much to say. That what? James prompted gently. That certain people were not truly people at all. The words came out barely above a whisper. And I am ashamed, James. Ashamed that I did not speak against it loudly enough. Ashamed that I was silent when I should have shouted. James stopped walking, turned to face her. You're speaking now, he said quietly. You're helping now. That counts for something. Does it? Does it count enough? I don't know, James admitted. I don't know if anything we do can balance out what's been done. But I know that stopping, giving up, turning away from the work, that definitely doesn't help. A commotion at the front entrance interrupted them. More wounded were arriving, these ones more severely injured. One of the American medics called out, Captain, we've got incoming. Bad ones. James was already moving, Margarethe following. The wounded being carried in were a mix, American and German, tangled together in injury and crisis. One of them was a German civilian, a woman with a massive wound in her abdomen. She was conscious, screaming in agony. Surgical theater now? James commanded. Margarethe, I need you. The next hours blurred together in the intensity of emergency medicine. The German woman had been caught in crossfire, her injuries catastrophic. James worked with fierce concentration, his hands moving with practiced precision through the most delicate surgery Margarethe had ever assisted in. Took 4 hours, 4 hours of painstaking work, of fighting for every heartbeat, every breath. When the woman was finally stabilized and moved to recovery, James stepped back from the table, his surgical gown soaked with blood, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Will she make it?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Margarethe answered honestly. "The next 24 hours will tell." James nodded, stripped off his gloves. "I need to talk to her family. Do we know if she has family?" "A daughter," one of the German nurses said. "She was brought in earlier, waiting in the hall." Margarethe found herself accompanying James as he went to speak with the daughter, a young woman perhaps 17 or 18, her face streaked with tears and dirt. James explained in his careful German what he had done, what the prognosis was, what the next steps would be. "You saved her?" the girl asked, her voice breaking. "You, an American, you saved my mother?" "I did my best," James said. "She's not out of danger yet, but she's alive." The girl looked at him for a long moment, then did something that surprised even Margarethe. She reached out and took James's hand, pressed it between both of hers. "Thank you," she said in English. "Thank you." James's composure finally cracked, just slightly. Margarethe saw his eyes glisten with unshed tears. "You're welcome," he managed. The dawn came gray and cold, light filtering through the broken windows of the hospital. Margarethe and James found themselves standing in the courtyard, looking out over the city. In the distance, smoke still rose from burning buildings. The sound of artillery had grown fainter, more distant. The war was moving on, leaving destruction in its wake. "How long have you been awake?" Margarethe asked. James checked his watch. 31 hours. 32, maybe. "You should rest." "So should you." Neither of them moved. "My wife thinks I'm crazy," James said suddenly. "Before I shipped out, she asked me why I volunteered for the medical corps when I could have stayed stateside, taught at the university. I told her," he paused, searching for words. "I told her that I became a doctor to save lives, and that if I stayed home while men were dying, I'd never be able to live with myself." "Do you regret it?" "Every day," James admitted. "And not at all. Does that make sense?" "Yes," Margarethe said. "Perfect sense." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two healers at the end of a long night, sharing the exhaustion and the satisfaction of lives saved, of doing work that mattered. "What will you do?" James asked. "After the war ends, when this is all over?" Margarethe considered the question. "Stay here, I think. Help rebuild. There will be much work to do. Much healing needed." She glanced at him. "And you? Go home. Back to Johns Hopkins if they'll have me. Try to forget what I've seen. Probably fail at forgetting." He smiled slightly. "Teach the next generation of surgeons. Try to instill in them what my mentor taught me, that being a doctor is a privilege and a responsibility. That we stand between life and death, and we don't get to choose sides." "You are a good teacher," Margarethe said. "I have learned from you. Not technique, I knew technique, but something else. Something about being human in inhuman times." James looked at her, and in his eyes Margarethe saw recognition, understanding, and something like respect. "You were human before I got here," he said quietly. "You just needed permission to show it. Permission to remember that the enemy is death, not each other." Over the next 3 days, they worked together to stabilize the hospital. More American medical personnel arrived, bringing supplies, precious supplies, including penicillin and morphine and plasma. The German nurses' fear gradually melted away as they saw the Americans treating everyone with the same professional care. Anna, the young nurse who had been so terrified, came to Margarethe on the 3rd day. "I was wrong," she said quietly. "The things we were told about the Americans. The things we believed. I was wrong." "We were all wrong about many things," Margarethe replied. "The important thing is that we learn, that we do better." On the 4th day, the German woman who had been caught in crossfire, Frau Bergmann, woke up. She was weak, in pain, but alive. When James came to check on her, she reached for his hand with trembling fingers. "They told me," she whispered in German, "told me you operated for 4 hours. An American doctor, saving a German woman. I'm just a doctor, James said. You were just a patient who needed help. My daughter, Frau Bergmann continued. She is all I have left. My husband died in Russia. My son died at Stalingrad. If I had died too. Her voice broke. You gave her back her mother. How can I thank you? Live, James said simply. Get better. Take care of your daughter. That's all the thanks I need. As the days passed, word spread through the civilian population. The American doctors who treated everyone. The German nurses who worked alongside former enemies. The hospital that had become, in its small way, a place where the rules of war didn't apply, where humanity reasserted itself. On the 7th day, a German doctor arrived, an older man named Dr. Werner, who had been hiding in the countryside, terrified of what the Americans would do to German medical personnel. He came hesitantly, expecting imprisonment or worse. Instead, James greeted him with a firm handshake. Dr. Werner? I'm Captain Morrison. I've heard about your work in thoracic surgery. I could really use your expertise. We've got 2 patients with chest wounds that are beyond my skill level. Dr. Werner stared at him in disbelief. You want me to operate? Here. If you're willing. I've reviewed the cases. They need someone with your specialization. One's American, one's German. If you can save either one, or both, I'd be grateful for your help. Margarethe watched as Dr. Werner's eyes filled with tears. I was told that you would. I know what you were told, James interrupted gently. But I'm telling you something different. I'm telling you that I need another surgeon, and you're one of the best in this region. I'm telling you that patients are dying who don't have to die, and that's not acceptable to me. So if you're willing to work with us, to help us save lives regardless of nationality, then you're welcome here. Dr. Werner nodded, unable to speak. James clapped him on the shoulder. Good. Get scrubbed up. Margarethe will show you the cases. We operate in an hour. The operations were successful, both patients survived. And as Margarethe watched James and Dr. Werner work together, saw the mutual respect that developed between them, saw how they communicated in the universal language of medicine, she understood something profound. Healing was possible. Not just physical healing, but something deeper. The healing of trust. The healing of the chasm that war had created between people who should never have been enemies in the first place. On the 10th day, James called a meeting of all the medical staff, American and German together. They gathered in the largest intact room, perhaps 40 people in total, exhausted but united by their shared work. I want to thank everyone here, James began, speaking in English with Margarethe quietly translating. American and German alike. Over the past 10 days, we've treated 163 patients. We've saved 147 lives. That's an extraordinary achievement, and it happened because you all chose to work together, to put aside fear and prejudice and focus on what matters. Healing. He paused, looking around the room. I know this hasn't been easy. I know there's still mistrust, still pain, still anger on both sides. That's understandable. That's human. But what I've seen here in this hospital gives me hope. Hope that when the war finally ends, we can find a way back to being human beings together, not just enemies defined by flags and borders. One of the German nurses raised her hand tentatively. Captain Morrison, what will happen to us when your army moves on? We're setting up a permanent military hospital here, James replied. Some of our personnel will stay, but we'll need German medical staff to continue operations. I'm recommending that all of you be retained in your positions, with back pay from the date of occupation. You've proven yourselves as skilled, compassionate professionals. That's all that matters to me. There was a moment of shocked silence, then a murmur of relief and gratitude. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Dr. Werner spoke up. Captain Morrison, I want to say something. He stood, his voice carrying across the room. I was ashamed. Ashamed of what Germany has done. Ashamed of what was done in our name. I hid because I thought I deserved punishment. But you showed me something different. You showed me that medicine transcends politics, that our duty to heal is more important than our nationality. You gave me back my purpose. For that, I thank you." Others began to speak. German nurses talking about how their fear had transformed into respect. American medics talking about what they had learned from their German colleagues. Patients who had survived because of the cooperation between former enemies. Margarethe found herself standing, her voice steady. "I was terrified when the Americans came. We all were. We had been told terrible things. But Captain Morrison and his team showed us the truth, that there are men and women on both sides who believe in something higher than war, who believe that life is sacred, that suffering demands response, that healing is possible even in the darkest times." She looked directly at James. "You did not just save lives here. You saved something else. You saved the idea that we can be better than our worst impulses, that we can choose compassion over hatred, that we can work together even when everything tells us we should be enemies. That is a greater healing than any surgery." The room erupted in applause, tentative at first, then stronger. Germans and Americans clapping together, a sound that represented something new, something fragile but real. James's eyes met Margarethe's across the room, and she saw in his face exhaustion, relief, and something else, satisfaction. The satisfaction of work well done, of principles upheld, of humanity affirmed in the face of inhumanity. That night, as the hospital settled into its new routine, Margarethe found James in his makeshift office, writing letters. "To the families," he explained, "the men we lost. It's the hardest part of my job, but they deserve to know. They deserve to know that their sons, their husbands, their fathers, that they were cared for, that they weren't alone at the end." "You write to the German families too?" Margarethe asked. "Of course. Death is death. Grief is grief." He signed a letter, set it aside, began another. "Before I left the States, a friend asked me what I hoped to accomplish in this war. I told him I hoped to save lives. But that wasn't complete. What I really hoped was that I could remain human, that I could go through this horror and come out the other side still able to see patients instead of enemies, still able to choose healing over hatred." "Have you succeeded?" James looked up at her. "Ask me again in 20 years. When the nightmares have faded, maybe, when I can remember without flinching. For now," he gestured around the room, at the hospital beyond. "For now, I think I'm doing okay." Margarethe smiled. "You are doing more than okay, James. You are doing what few men can do. You are being a light in darkness." "We're being a light," James corrected. "You, me, Dr. Werner, Anna, all of us. Together." "Together," Margarethe echoed. And in that word was hope. Hope for the future, hope for healing, hope that the wounds of war might someday close. The war in Europe ended 3 weeks later. But in the Heidelberg hospital, the real work, the work of healing, of rebuilding trust, of proving that humanity could triumph over hatred, had only just begun. The war in Europe ended 3 weeks later. But in the Heidelberg hospital, the real work, the work of healing, of rebuilding trust, of proving that humanity could triumph over hatred, continued long after the guns fell silent. James stayed for 2 more months, helping to establish the permanent military hospital and training program. On his last day, he found Margarethe in the surgical theater, preparing for an operation. "I leave tomorrow," he said quietly. Margarethe's hands stilled over the instrument tray. "I know. Dr. Werner told me. You'll be fine without me. Better than fine. You and Werner make an excellent team. We learned from a good teacher." She turned to face him. "Will you write? Let us know you arrived home safely?" "I will." James pulled a small notebook from his pocket, tore out a page with an address written on it. "Johns Hopkins. When things settle here, if you ever want to continue your training, to study in America, I can help arrange it." Margarethe took the paper, held it carefully. "Perhaps, when the world is less broken." "The world will always be a little broken," James said. "That's why it needs people like you, people who choose to heal instead of harm." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of shared experience between them. The long nights, the desperate surgeries, the lives saved and lost, the bridge built between enemies. "Thank you, James," Margarethe said finally, "for showing us that the enemy was never each other, that the enemy was always just death and suffering and fear." "You knew that already," James replied. "You just needed permission to act on it." "Perhaps we both did." James extended his hand. Margarethe shook it firmly, then, impulsively, pulled him into a brief embrace. "Go home to your wife. Teach your students. Remember us. Always," James promised. As his jeep pulled away the next morning, Margarethe stood in the hospital courtyard with Anna and Dr. Werner and the other nurses, watching until he disappeared around the corner. The building behind them still bore the scars of war. Broken windows, cracked walls, hastily patched roof. But inside, patients were healing. German and American doctors worked side by side. And in the surgical theater where so many lives had been saved, the lights burned bright against the darkness. The war was over. The healing had just begun. And in a small hospital in Heidelberg, a handful of people had proven that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion could survive. That medicine had no borders. That a patient was simply a patient, and a healer's duty was to heal. That, in the end, was victory enough.